Hello, everyone, whoever is joining from different parts of the world. I'm Sulakshna, and I'm co-chair of the People's Health Movement. And today I will be moderating this session. This is plenary number 2 in the Prince Mahidol Award Conference, which we usually hold, offline. But of course, due to the situation, current situation, we are holding it online. The title of the session of the plenary is How Are We Dealing with COVID-19? And even as the world is dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, there are experiences that we need to share with each other and lessons that we need to learn. And while health systems of most countries have struggled to respond to the crisis, there are those also that have shown exceptional strength. And let us not forget the hard work of health workers, doctors, nurses, and other frontline workers such as community health workers, sanitation workers, and allied health professionals. And many of those who in many countries have had to face problems in accessing adequate protective equipment and often have to work without adequate remuneration. The pandemic has once again brought to the fore the importance of investing in public health, strong public health systems, comprehensive primary health care, and the role of health workers and other frontline workers. And while the pandemic underscores the importance of global and regional cooperation and solidarity, it has also heightened the crisis in governance for health. Many countries have used the pandemic as an opportunity to foster local innovation and production. However, the issue of access to medical products for prevention and treatment of COVID-19 remains a challenge, especially for poor people in poor countries. Regional cooperation and multilateralism are essential at this time to ensure equitable distribution of resources. And in this, we can see the significance of the WHO and the UN agencies, and we can also recognize the challenges and concerns with regards to multi-stakeholder organizations in furthering equity and a human rights approach in dealing with the pandemic. Moreover, the implications of social determinants of health on people's well-being have never been so starkly illustrated. Within countries, the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities, with the more vulnerable groups suffering either due to the disease or due to the steps taken to curb the pandemic. This plenary will provide an opportunity to discuss the insights and the evidence on how governments and the global community are dealing with this crisis and its implications for the most vulnerable and marginalized communities. I want to tell you that, under this plenary 2, under this theme, we have held a series of webinars, and I would request the PMAC Secretariat to share the link of the YouTube links of the webinars in the chat so that, you could also go through them. There was a range of issues were discussed, and today we sort of trying to bring together all the learnings that we've had in the webinars, and we have an excellent group of panelists with expertise on these issues. So I will go ahead and introduce our first panelist, Ms. Charlotte Petrie Gornitzka, who's the Deputy Executive Director of United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. Ms. Gornitzka has nearly 20 years of experience in international development and has successfully built innovative partnerships with leaders from civil society, national governments, and the private sector to deliver program results and influence critical policy changes. She has served as the chair of the Development Assistance Committee at the OECD, and has been the Director General of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, along with she's held many other posts, for example, at the International Save the Children Alliance and at the Swedish Red Cross. Ms. Charlotte will be talking about the impact of COVID on the most vulnerable communities, especially children, and the action that has been taken and is yet to be taken globally in order to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. I now invite Ms. Gornitzka to kindly make her presentation.
Thank you very much for this important meeting and the opportunity. And let me start by this recent statement from the UN Secretary General. Our world has reached a heart-wrenching milestone. The COVID-19 pandemic has now claimed 2 million lives. Behind this staggering number are names and faces. The smile, now only a memory. The seat, forever empty at the dinner table. The room that echoes with the silence of a loved one. It became clear early on that this pandemic was more than a health crisis. It's a socioeconomic crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a security crisis, and a human rights crisis. It has affected us as individuals, as families, communities, and societies. It has impacted on every generation, including on those not yet born. The devastation wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic has deepened, infecting over 100 million people. Since the outset of the pandemic, governments, the United Nations systems, and their partners have paid special attention to those countries and groups with least ability to cope with the virus and its repercussions. Almost a quarter of infected people live in countries facing humanitarian or refugee crisis, estimating that 235 million people will need humanitarian assistance and protection. Among the hardest hit groups, there are women, children, older persons, those with disabilities, those with mental health considerations, and those who are on the move. Many poor countries are amidst a dangerous second wave, and new and more infectious variants will make the situation worse. Poverty is rising, inequality is growing. The worst global economic contraction in 90 years, a decade of lost per capita income growth, looming sovereign debt defaults, extreme poverty rising for the first time in 20 years, triggering a steep upsurge in food insecurity and multiple famines, and disappearing public services. For example, in countries across ASEAN, home to over 647 million people, the pandemic has badly hit families already struggling to put food on the table and educate their children. People have lost jobs and income security, further increasing inequalities. It has piled new layers of hardship on countries highly prone to natural disasters and buffeted by climate change. And the COVID-19 crisis is also a child rights crisis. And children in particular will bear the consequences for years. The pandemic has upended the essential services that secure the health, education, and protection of our children and young people. It is affecting their mental health and pushing their families into poverty. They need their lives back. There are three main ways in which children have been affected. First, by direct infection with the disease itself. Second, by the immediate consequences of actions to contain the pandemic, such as school closures and the disruption of essential health and immunization services. And third, by the socioeconomic crisis that threatens to erase long-term development gains. The crisis is battering essential services that secure the education and protection of our children, often with deadly costs. The most vulnerable children, such as those affected by poverty, exclusion, or family violence, are facing even greater risks cut off from existing support. We will see disruption in routine immunization campaigns, leaving millions of children vulnerable to killer diseases like measles and cholera. And one area where we see so clearly the devastating impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable is in education. Despite overwhelming evidence of the impact of school closures on children, and despite increasing evidence that schools are not the drivers of the pandemic, too many countries have opted to keep schools closed, some for nearly a year. Globally, 3 out of 4 students who cannot be reached by remote learning opportunities come from rural areas and/or poor households. And in East Asia and the Pacific, at least 80 million or 20% of children have not been able to access digital and broadcast remote learning during COVID-19. Because of school closures, children's health, development, safety, and well-being are at risk, and the most vulnerable among them will bear the heaviest brunt. Without school meals, children are left hungry and their nutrition is worsening. Without daily interactions with their peers and a reduction in mobility, they are losing physical fitness and showing signs of mental distress. Without the safety net that schools often provides, they are more vulnerable to abuse, child marriage, and child labor. Children are less likely to get sick from the virus, but we must act now so they do not become the hidden victims, bearing the brunt of the long-term impacts of the crisis. We are now nearly 1 year into the global struggle with COVID-19. Over the past year, the impact of the pandemic has revealed many unmet needs and opportunities in the delivery of health services. For example, COVID-19 has shown the need to improve safety in healthcare facilities, including infection prevention and control. It has revealed weaknesses in the quality and resilience of systems that provide essential and life-saving services. A recent UNICEF survey found that 63% of countries reported disruption in antenatal checkups and 59% in postnatal care. In addition, almost 68% of countries reported at least some disruption in health checks for children and immunization services. But there are also things we can fix. We now have a critical window of opportunity to reverse this child right crisis and reimagine a better future. By working together, we can assure COVID-19 does not threaten social and economic development for a long time to come and help make families and communities more resilient. This starts with resisting the temptation to deprioritize investments in our future. In fact, we must do the opposite, taking this opportunity to build back better and greener. Investments in education, child protection, health and nutrition, and water and sanitation will reduce damage caused by COVID-19. UNICEF has a 6-point agenda that sets out the key steps needed to respond to COVID-19. First, ensure all children learn, including by closing the digital divide. Secondly, guarantee access to health and nutrition services and make vaccines affordable and available to every child. Third, support and protect the mental health of children and young people and bring an end to abuse, gender-based violence, and neglect in childhood. Fourth, increase access to clean water, sanitation, and hygiene, and address environmental degradation and climate change. 5, reverse the rise in child poverty and ensure an inclusive recovery for all. And 6th, redouble efforts to protect and support children and their families living through conflict, disasters, and displacement. COVID-19 is a global problem, and COVAX is a global solution. A world where COVID-19 is no longer a threat to humanity requires the most massive public health effort in history that recognizes universal access to health as a critical global public good. Part of this response is a new global collaboration, the Access to COVID-19 Tools, the ACT Accelerator. The aim of this is to accelerate development, production, and equitable access to COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. The massive global demand will mean that not everyone will be able to get the vaccine at the same time. It will take months, maybe years, to create enough vaccines doses for everyone around the world. Acknowledging that while vaccines show their way out, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And the risk that the most fragile countries are at the end of a long, slow-moving queue for the vaccines is troubling. Vaccines are reaching high-income countries quickly, while the world's poorest have none at all. We need manufacturers to step up to their commitments to work with the COVAX facility and countries around the world to ensure enough supply and fair distribution. And to gain public trust, we must boost vaccine confidence and knowledge with effective communication grounded in facts. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very comprehensive, you very comprehensively outlined, all the issues. And I think, for us, I think it was so useful to understand, the 6 steps that UNICEF is recommending. And I do hope all of us together would be able to pursue and advocate for this in the countries and in the organizations in which we work. And of course, the impact on children has been really severe. And thank you for outlining that and the issue of equity in the vaccine distribution. Now I would like to call on our second panelist, Dr. Takao Toda, who is Special Advisor to the President for Global Health and Human Security from Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. And he's been involved in strategic planning and implementation of JICA's operations. And for more than 3 decades, he has been playing various roles of strategizing and implementing its plans. He has a wide range of knowledge and experience, especially on the operationalization process of human security, which has been a core concept of Japan's diplomatic policy internationally. He's well known to regular participants of PMAC, and he will be speaking about what we have learned from tackling COVID-19 in terms of strengthening health systems. Dr. Toda, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, for very precious and attractive opportunities. Let me ask you, all the participants of this important session, if possible, by seeing a photo of sunrise. And let me ask you, what is your impression? And what do you feel? Or what do you think immediately when you see this photo? I asked the same questions to youngsters in Japan, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, all over the world. After COVID-19 started to be our, crisis. Most of people responded to me like this. Oh, what a beautiful sunrise. But what I did want them to think is that there are a variety of feelings and impressions when people all over the world see this photo. In fact, even in Japan, more than 4 million youngsters out of job, suicide rate increasing. Lots of people may not want to see another sunrise. And that is a reality. And that is a reality that this pandemic is causing. How are we dealing with COVID-19? Or how should we deal with COVID-19? That is a question to be asked to everybody. To answer these questions, Based on our experiences on the ground, let me raise three important perspectives. The first one is about shareability of our resources and the utilization of shareable or non-exclusive resources. Now, people are talking about a lot vaccine nationalism. This might symbolize the limit of making full use of limited resources globally. What is limited resource? Such as money and materials. Vaccine nationalism signifies the increase of inequality and the division between rich countries and poor countries, and social destabilization might be the result of that. We have to be very much realistic to say that it is impossible for all of us to share the vaccination in a proper time, in a perfectly equal way. What is the solution? Shall we give up the vaccine? No. But we have to think wise about the possibility of finding some other productive solutions. That is the utilization of shareable knowledges and wisdoms. COVID-19 pandemic has negative perspectives, but at the same time, it has a positive perspective. What is it? That is, this is a pandemic which is happening in the midst of global information technology utilization. So it is possible, theoretically and pragmatically, we can use knowledge and wisdom more widely to share and to cope with COVID-19. This is my first point. The second point is people's power and solidarity. Japan learned, in fact, a lot from Taiwan, Vietnam, and some other countries. In case of Taiwan, let me take one example. That is the leadership of Dr. Audrey Tan and her mask up system is very well known. But that mask up system has not been completed by her genius capabilities. No. That was completed by the support of so many so-called civic hackers and ordinary people. That is, she was very much successful to mobilize people's power and reinforcing solidarities to show the highest performance of the world against COVID-19 in her country. And my third point is about the versatility. We talked about a lot again, about the emergence of several variants of COVID-19. It is a nature of pandemic that is unexpected, and it is, realistically speaking, impossible to be well prepared for all the possible risks with very much limited resources. So, one of the most effective and resilient way of being prepared is looking for the versatility or multi-purposeness of solutions in every aspect, in every territory of our war against the risks. We talked a lot about the washing hand, sanitation, water, and nutrition. But also, we need to talk a lot more about the cutting-edge research should be much more aligned to the versatile, effective results Let me take one example. That is an also molecular approach. Some scientists are now focusing on improving the function of mitochondria. That is to say, in a more plain word, molecular level health promotions. And some scientists start talking about the amino acid, especially enormous potential of using 11 non-essential amide acid. These things are very much, how to say, useful and possible for mass production all over the world, including in the developing countries, and conserved in the normal temperature and effective against so many diseases, and quasi-free from monopoly or oligarchy, and as a result, might contribute to decrease the feelings of inequality and disabilities. So I said, shareable resources utilization, people's power and solidarity, and a versatile solution. We need to look for these three perspectives in a much more enthusiastic ways. Having said that, these things might be characterized in one concept, that is human security. Practice of human security means, first of all, the imagination and the empathy to the people all over the world. When we see the sunset or sunrise, we can always think about people in the most serious situations. And I'm sure all the attendants here have such imagination. But my point is that we need to share this sort of feeling, empathy, power of imagination to be realized in the brain, in the heart of ordinary people, in the rich, well-off people in the world. Having said that, let me repeat. Shareable resources and a wisdom-based approach, people's power and solidarity, and the versatility. Let us be cautiously optimistic about our future by making full use of these three weapons. And I'm sure through this, we can create the new normal. 1 minute more, please. So as introduced, I have been engaged in the glorious development of PMAC since a long time ago. And I'm going to retire. So this is my final presentation on behalf of Japan International Cooperation Agency. Although global health is my lifetime issue, and I will continue to look for my possibility to contribute, but this will be my probably formal appearance. So I'd like to say heartfelt thanks to all of you here, to the Secretariat, and to my dear colleagues, such as Dr. Sweet and the Thai people, for providing me these glorious opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Toda. I'm sure you will be involved in some way or the other, with PMAC. And thank you very much for joining us today. So I would to introduce the next panelist, Professor Fran Baum, who's the co-chair of the Steering Council of the People's Health Movement, along with me. And People's Health Movement, as many of you would already know, is a global movement of activists, civil society, education institutions, of people who believe in the right to health and in comprehensive primary healthcare. So Professor Baum is also the Matthew Flinders Distinguished Professor of Public Health at the Southgate Institute of Health, Society and Equity, and is also director of the WHO Collaborating Center on the Socio-Political Commercial Determinants of Health. Among her many achievements to her name is that she's been recently appointed to the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health. And she has written books that include The New Public Health and Governing for Health. And she has also served as a commissioner on WHO's Commission on Social Determinants of Health, and is a passionate advocate for health equity, social justice, and uses her research program on the social economic determinants of health as a basis for this advocacy. Today she will be speaking on charting a social determinants and a human rights-based approach to COVID-19 response and to the future in terms of what we have learned from this pandemic. So please, Fran, go ahead.
Sawadee Ka, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's really good to be here, and thanks to PMAC for organising the conference as ever, and also thanks to Shalakshana for putting so much work into organising this session. Now, I want to focus particularly on how we can deal with the issues that have been laid bare by the pandemic. And most importantly, I want to put the position that while COVID-19 is occupying most of our thoughts at the moment, it is only one of many crises that the world is facing. There are many financial crises, we're going back to particularly to 2008, which have led to austerity politics, low wage growth while there have been high profits, casualised, insecure and exploitative work. There's also what I've called institutional malaise. There have been cutbacks to our public services, restructuring, redundancies, privatisation. There's corporations that avoid tax, which means there's less money for public good, and profits are put before people, and it's harsh and uncaring. And I think as you can see how I go through these, they're very much causing the sort of environment within which COVID hit us. There's been something of a social crisis, particularly, I think, in high-income countries, in terms of isolation, declining social capital, the lack of community and solidarity, and of course, fundamentalism and terrorism. Political leadership in many countries has become populist. There's declining trust in our political leaders. There's been the growth of fake news, the rejection of sort of evidence and science. And of course, most importantly, there's an ecological and climate crisis, with increasing disasters and more pandemics forecast. So that's the situation in which the pandemic hit us. But perhaps most importantly, and I want you to have a look at the middle of the star, that all this is, I think, being caused by an unfair global economic and political system that's based on extractivist capitalism. That's giving us excess wealth for some people. It's given us growing inequities, overconsumption and underconsumption, and a focus on profit above all. So I'll come back to that later, but let's just, if you think about that's the many crises we've got. Well, when COVID hit, people who were already living in vulnerable circumstances were really exposed by COVID. And I'll point to this article that a few of us from PHM, led by Lauren Kaymoa, and we've isolated that these groups in particular, people living in poverty, Black people, ethnic minorities and Indigenous people, have been particularly affected by COVID. Just one example from the US, you can see the death rates are so much higher for Black and Indigenous people than for white and other Americans. In the UK, these data are from the UK, they're showing the difference in the death rate between the least deprived, which are at the bottom of the graph, and the most deprived. And you can see that there's a massive difference. And that's really just highlighting existing inequities. And I think the pandemic has also isolated exploitative working and living conditions. People who are employed in casual work have multiple jobs. They lose their income if they try to isolate. Precarious workers who often have other vulnerabilities, they may be migrants. Women especially exposed as the majority of care workers, both informal and informal. For instance, community health workers who have very often been at the front line of the pandemic. And for many people, if they lose their income, they have no social protection. And meat workers are a good example of such vulnerable workers. Low-wage people have also had higher pandemic job losses. Already there's been very little, even though profits have gone up, there's been very little wage growth in the world, and the lowest income people have suffered most in this pandemic. Oxfam recently reported that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and they noted that worldwide the wealth of billionaires has increased by an amazing 3.9 trillion in just about 9 months last year. And they also predict that it will take a decade for poor people to recover. And even more, the world's richest 10 men have seen their combined wealth increase by $500,000. We've already heard about the problem of vaccines for the world, or just that small increase in their wealth. It's a large increase, but it's a small part of their wealth, would be enough to pay for a vaccine for everyone and ensure that no one is pushed into poverty by the pandemic. I just want here to point to the work that PHN has been doing in response to that issue of the vaccine. But you can see here in this graph that the countries that have the vaccine are, of course, the rich countries: Canada, Australia, Britain, US, the EU. And if you look down here at COVAX, which is meant to be providing for so many low and middle income countries, has very few of the vaccine. So that's really important. So my argument is that with all those overlapping crises, we need a social as well as a biological vaccine. And here I think there are 4 areas that this vaccine has to look at: providing everybody with a life for security, opportunities that are fair, a planet that we can continue to live on and that supports biodiversity, and governance that is just. So I can imagine people saying, oh, but how can we afford all this? But I think it's very important to think that wealth is not essential for a good pandemic response. We already know the history of many countries that achieve good health at low cost. But here, a recent report from the Australian Lowy Institute looked at the countries that had done best, and they rated New Zealand, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Cyprus, and Rwanda. So clearly that wasn't just about wealth. And then if you look at those at the bottom, you can see that the US is there very clearly. So it's really about how we distribute money, not about there being enough. And a life with security would be about providing a universal system to guarantee health services, income, employment, housing, and energy for all. It would be about a progressive taxation system. It would be about binding and enforced treaty to avoid war, occupation, and conflicts, and encourage international cooperation. And it would deal with the legacy of extractive capitalism. And Jesse Bump from Harvard led a very good article on that issue in this special PNET BMJ article. In terms of fair opportunities, we know that investing in universal, free or affordable education from early childhood right through to tertiary level is vital. We know that discrimination on the basis of racial, sex and disability should be illegal and should be part of a culture that this does not happen. Fair and decent employment where people are employed on a fair basis, where they have access to sick leave is also important. And we need to create urban, rural and food environments that support healthy living choices for all, because those healthy living choices themselves will protect us from the pandemic. And of course, we can fund all that by some of the measures such as ensuring that corporations pay their full tax and increasing the rate of taxation and including taxes such as a wealth tax. Now, I can't say much about the overlap between the state of our planet and climate change and global warming, but it's very clear that COVID itself is just one of the latest dangerous infectious diseases that has come from the way that we have chopped down trees, chopped down forests, and generally increased the transmission opportunities from animals into humans. And just to point out that with these multiple crises we're facing, then there's going to be a cumulative trauma. And just in Australia, we know that mental health got worse, and the overall rate of high psychological distress was 16%. But for people who had suffered in those awful bushfires we had in Australia last year, the figure was 41%. So it's an accumulative trauma from these overlapping crises. And then finally, I think perhaps this is what we have learned most from COVID, is that we need governance that's just. We need global governance for health rather than profit. That's through trade agreements and, for instance, IP rights, such as the TRIPS waiver that we could now have to ensure that there isn't intellectual property on vaccines, making them much cheaper. We need a binding treaty on business and human rights that is endorsed. We need a democratization of the governance of all institutions, universities, health and social services, banks. All institutions should be reflecting in a much greater way the needs of ordinary people. That can also be expressed through worker empowerment, through trade unions, cooperative and labour protection laws. And of course, we need to support and protect civil society. And one of the features of the pandemic, or responses to the pandemic, has been a kind of a clampdown on civil society and reducing the space for civil society. And I think that's really dangerous. So the important thing about all these measures is that they will involve tackling unfair distribution of power and resources. And usually when people are asked to give up power, they don't want to do that. So the question is, how can we do that peacefully? COVID, I think, has given us a chance to pause, reflect, consider. I think the question for all of us, for people in the world, particularly those who currently hold the power and resources, is will we take that opportunity and create a sustainable, healthy and equitable world? And I think that question is still very much open. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fran, for your excellent presentation. I think the diagram, the infographic that you showed at the beginning, the framework, I think that's something we all will be using for a very, very long time. So thank you very much for that. Now I want to introduce the next panelist, Dr. Jos van der Leer, who's the Director for Emergencies at the Southeast Asia region of the World Health Organization. Prior to this, Dr. van der Leer was the WHO representative to Nepal and has worked in the area of immunization in WHO in Philippines, India, Myanmar, and as chief of UNICEF's Global Immunization Program. He has a long history on working on humanitarian and emergency issues with MSF, International Organization for Migration, UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He's a medical doctor with a public health degree from Harvard. And we welcome him to talk about the regional cooperation for COVID-19 response, the role of WHO, and issues of governance for access to COVID-19 technologies.
Thank you very much, and very good evening to everybody. It's really a pleasure to join you here tonight. Due to unforeseen circumstances, our regional director, Dr. Poonam Ketrapal Singh, could not join this important meeting, and she has asked to deliver on her behalf a message to this audience. And I quote, "Warm greetings to all on this panel and to the participants from across the world. The Prince Mahidol Award Conference has for many years held a special place in my heart and has been the source of great progress in the Southeast Asia region and beyond. It is yet another example of Thailand's global leadership in health and development. Today, I will address two subjects. First, the regional cooperation and the role of WHO, and second, governance for access to COVID-19 technologies. Linking both subjects is a value that is critical to all public health endeavors, and that is solidarity. Solidarity and cooperation have been central to what we in the Southeast Asian region have for many years been striving to achieve. Such efforts are reflected in several innovative mechanisms within the region, such as the Southeast Asia Regional Health Emergency Fund and the Southeast Asia Regulatory Network. They are also reflected in how the region engages at the global level, for example, through the Regional One Voice initiative and via the region's contributions to other countries and regions, and most recently, member state efforts to harness vaccine manufacturing capacity for the global good. The region's culture of solidarity and cooperation, facilitated and promoted by WHO, has been central to its COVID-19 response. Throughout the response, we have seen countries donate and share key resources. As early as February 2020, India and Thailand, both of which have advanced laboratory capacity, began testing laboratory samples from neighboring countries. India continues to donate vaccines to several countries in the region and beyond, helping to accelerate the global vaccine rollout. We have seen countries draw on institutional strengths and assets. In the first quarter of 2020, Bhutan, Thailand, and Maldives applied for immediate response funding from the CRHEV, which was rapidly approved, helping them to implement locally tailored national response plans. The IHR Knowledge Network has facilitated real-time learning between countries, helping leaders adapt and apply global knowledge and guidance to their local context. And we have seen member states uphold their global commitments. Across the region, the IHR guided action and promoted cooperation and transparency. It was Thailand that reported the first case of COVID-19 outside China, demonstrating the virus's capacity for international spread. The region's spirit of solidarity and cooperation, reflected in its culture, institutions, and commitment to global health security, is well captured in its declaration on the collective response to COVID-19, which was adopted by all countries in September at the WHO Regional Committee for Southeast Asia. WHO's role in promoting and nurturing such values is embedded in our daily work, and the strategic support outlined in our country cooperation strategies, our flagship priorities, and our sustain, accelerate, innovate vision. It is also reflected in the diplomatic and convening power that has been a feature of our response thus far. Since March 2020, WHO has convened regular meetings with hundreds of health partners in the region and beyond, helping to align partner and donor interests with member state needs, which has also been achieved via the Partners Platform and Central Supply Portal. WHO has worked closely with multilateral bodies such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which spans 2 WHO regions and has its own strategic framework for public health emergencies. The regional office has convened and participated in working groups with partner UN agencies, including the UN OCHA Emergency Preparedness Working Group, which has continued to strengthen disaster risk reduction efforts in parallel to the response. We have mobilized operational partnerships, including with the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, GORN, and with emergency medical teams, EMTs, to fill gaps and steer the response in areas that are particularly vulnerable, such as Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where around 800,000 Rohingya people reside. We will continue to discharge these and other duties in our efforts to advance regional global solidarity and cooperation and to bring this pandemic to an end. This brings me to the second part of this discussion, namely governance for access to COVID-19 technologies. As you know, in April 2020, the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, or the ACT Accelerator, was launched by governments, global health organizations, civil society groups, businesses, and philanthropies from across the world, with the aim of securing equitable access to COVID-19 diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. The ACT Accelerator is the most high-profile global governance initiative to promote access to COVID-19 technologies in response to the pandemic, at a time when multilateral cooperation is most needed. The initiative's vaccines pillar is known as the COVID-19 Vaccine Global Access Facility, or COVAX facility, which is designed to guarantee the fair and equitable distribution and availability of vaccines. Almost all countries in the region have signed on to the COVAX facility, which aims to deliver 2 billion doses of vaccines against COVID-19 globally by the end of 2021, allowing all participating countries to vaccinate 20% of their population. But the success of the initiative is not yet guaranteed and is in fact threatened by the bilateral deals that countries across the world continue to sign with manufacturers. Some wealthier countries have bought up vast quantities of multiple vaccines at the development stage itself, putting additional strain on what are already limited supplies. Success is also dependent on the quality of governance within countries themselves, for which it's imperative that they finalize national deployment and vaccination plans and also address outstanding legislative and regulatory compliance issues. In the coming weeks and months, we must do all we can to strengthen COVAX's chances of success, which in addition to dissuading countries from pursuing bilateral deals, means securing adequate funding, including an extra $18.1 billion over the next 18 months. Additional funding is also required for the diagnostic and therapeutic arms of the ACT accelerator, which require an extra $5.3 and $6.1 billion respectively. While supporting all arms of the ACT accelerator, WHO will continue to champion the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which compiles in one place the pledges of commitment made under the Solidarity Call to Action to voluntarily share COVID-19 health technology-related knowledge, intellectual property, and data. We will continue to support countries to facilitate timely, equitable, and affordable access to COVID-19 diagnostic, therapeutics, medicines, and vaccines, consistent with the provisions of relevant international treaties, including the provisions of the Agreement on Trade-related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights and the flexibilities within the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and Public Health. I'm inspired by member state commitments to further strengthen global health governance, including by securing WHO funding. The emergence and spread of COVID-19 has underscored the vital role that WHO plays in coordinating global health and in promoting the solidarity upon which the health security of all countries depends. The WHO Southeast Asia region will continue to draw on and promote regional and global solidarity and cooperation, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the most effective way to achieve a healthier, more health secure, and sustainable future for all. I thank the many partners present today for their support and look forward to our ongoing collaboration." Unquote. I echo, of course, that sentiment of the regional director, and I look forward to the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing the message of Dr. Singh's. I have been attending the previous plenaries, and I think a lot of discussion and concerns have been around, the IPR issues, and especially, the issue of, in the WTO, the TRIPS waiver, on the intellectual property rights. So that was something that I think even in the Q&A, maybe we could discuss subsequently. So now I want to introduce our last presenter, Dr. Zafar Mirza, who's the former State Minister of Health of Pakistan and former Director Health Systems in World Health Organization. Dr. Mirza has worked with WHO in various capacities. He was the Director Health System Development at the WHO Regional Office for East Mediterranean, EMRO, acting WHO representative for Iran, team leader, public health innovation and intellectual property at WHO. He is the founding executive director for the Network for Consumer Protection with a focus on health and pharmaceutical policies. He has served on various, and he serves on various international faculty of Boston School of Public Health and Stanford School of Public Health, and on various advisory groups and task forces. He's a medical graduate with a post-graduation in public health from LSHTM, and has co-authored multiple publications on issues of WTO, on access to medical technologies and innovation. So we welcome him to speak about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic and its measures on non-COVID conditions and services, and what have been the opportunities and learnings for health systems strengthening.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And previous speakers have alluded to and explained the kind of challenges that COVID-19 situation has brought to us. Let me begin by making two statements. The first one is that I think that the situation that we are in and the challenges that we have, it will be a great opportunity loss that if we go back to the situation that we were in with reference to health system and healthcare prior to the COVID-19. And I think my second point with regard to this is that I think the global nature of this pandemic actually require us to think as a global community to develop a parallel to something like a Marshall Plan, which the world saw after the Second World War in the health sphere. Obviously, that required a very gigantic effort and a global solidarity and a lot of wisdom and thinking. But I think that is the scale of the response in 21st century that all of us need to put together in order to move forward and to overcome the inequities in health and the marginalization of people with healthcare, etc. I want to basically focus on two aspects in my few minutes that I have. The first is that I think that what we are not realizing still at this stage is that non-COVID-19 related health conditions and diseases, how they have increased in the meanwhile, how they are affecting people, how we don't know more about them, because COVID-19 situation, we have not been able to gather information. Lockdowns and smart lockdowns have burdened systems, and we have not gathered enough information. And I think the fallout on the human health on non-COVID-19 sphere is so broad and so deep that we are not even beginning to understand that how much fallout it has. Obviously, it depends upon the situations that countries were in before COVID-19. Obviously, it also depends upon the health information systems which were there prior to COVID-19. There are few estimates made and there are few papers written already about what has happened to, for example, maternal and child health care, on non-communicable diseases, on communicable diseases other than COVID-19, and especially on mental health. But as I said, we hardly has this information at the moment because I think the challenge of overall healthcare has increased tremendously during this period. Just to give you one example, in Pakistan, where I have worked during the COVID-19 and before, the essential immunization, the routine immunization, as we call them, for children, has dramatically gone down. We have missed, as unfortunately Pakistan is still a country where polio prevails, and we have missed 2 national polio campaigns during this period, and the number of cases have been on the rise. And we really don't know because we don't have the system in place which can accurately inform us that what damage we have seen during this period. I particularly want to say a few things also about mental health. Not only because mental health disorders were already very much there and they were increasing, the burden of disease due to mental health was increasing, but the distress and the stress which COVID-19 has brought on society, on health workers, on people in isolations, we are not even beginning to account for it. We are not even ready to measure it. So I think as hopefully we will move out from COVID-19 in coming months and years, the challenge of healthcare would have multiplied. So this is why I mentioned in the beginning that we need a very different scale of response for healthcare, especially in low and middle income countries, but actually all over the world. The second major point that I want to make very quickly is that I think we need to also reimagine the healthcare system fundamentally. We traditionally have been thinking about healthcare system having 6 building blocks, and we have been very conveniently working on those. But I think the COVID-19 has brought also a very new dimensions which needs to be added to our thinking and our conceptualization of health systems. Just to name a few. So for example, the essential public health functions which were not finding their enough place in health system conceptualization now need to have a central place in health systems. We also need to bring risk communication as a very important building block in the health systems. Although we have been on the sidelines working on the need for intersectoral collaboration and the determinants of health, but I think we can no more think about these things as sideline menus. But what COVID-19 has actually brought us this realization that unless and until there is a centrality of intersectoral collaboration, neither you can generate appropriate healthcare response in times of emergencies, but also you cannot actually move forward effectively alone. But also, very importantly, I think that the emergency health response, preparation and response in the context of IHR has also been ignored in our health system thinking. Unless emergency strikes, we have not been actually working on these issues. But again, I think that the health security and health emergency preparation and response, and hand in hand with that, the national coordination mechanisms, all these issues need to be now very much part of the health systems. And what we have also realized is that among low and middle income countries, especially, but also in high income countries, where good responses have been generated in relative terms, very quickly national coordination mechanisms were put in place. And where these coordination mechanisms could be put in place, the responses have been better. But where the different provinces or federal governments have been working separately, the national responses have been weak and disjointed, and also they have not been very effective. So one thing also which it has come to brought to our attention is the technical nature of the leadership vis-a-vis the political leadership in the countries. And I think it is also critically important that during, especially in the new generation of leaders in decision-making positions, must have technical knowledge, and only then they can actually generate better responses and provide better advice to the heads of the states and to the prime ministers. So I think that it is also bringing us a great opportunity. As I was earlier talking about intersectoral collaboration, we have been also talking about health in all policies. But I think COVID-19 has also brought us a huge opportunity now, because there is a receptiveness all across sectors for the need for health in all policies. So I will end by saying that it is absolutely very important, and the humanity must take this challenge, that we need to generate a new parallel of something like a Marshall Plan for health sector in the world as we move out of COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mirza. And may I now request all the panelists to please, put your videos on. We will now go. We have around 20 minutes of Q&A, and questions have been coming in. And I think for each panelist there is a question. So we will go ahead with the question and answer session. I really think that, we have actually spoken about, and we have touched upon all aspects and all dimensions of, what is happening right now in the pandemic and what we are learning from it. So the first question that has come in, I would address it to Charlotte Gornitzka. So there are a couple of questions that are around, recommending reopening of schools, how to deal, when any possible with any possible risks to the teachers, the educators, and also now that, but the question is also, now that it's really not seen to be ending very soon, what are the kind of guidelines or policies that need to be made in terms of reopening on schools, and also including there was a question on delivery of food for severely acute malnourished children. So I think both issue of nutrition and of education, how to ensure their resumption, and what are the steps that UNICEF is recommending for that?
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very aligned panel in describing both the very, very big challenge we are tackling, and also the importance of focusing in tackling. So on education, so UNICEF, together with other UN agencies, as well as the World Bank and others, have been advocating for keeping schools open. And we think the evidence that is shown is that the net gain is much greater than the risks. But obviously we need to be careful in the advice we put forward, and knowing that of course we need to protect the educators. We need to make sure that schools are opened in a planned way, and I would say that there are many examples now of how schools opening have been tackled, many ideas on how to keep distance and so on and so forth. And UNICEF is there to advise, obviously. We have also argued that when the vaccine is there in many of these hardest to reach places, we need to support and vaccine the front runners, the health workers, the most at risk. And we would argue that we could include educators in that group because they need to feel safe to be able to educate our kids. In parallel with this, I think it's also important to see that the world has never before gathered around education, independent on rich and poor. And everybody has seen something happening around education. And one of the things we see in my part of the world is that remote learning, schools and children who are connected, they might not say it's the best education they have had, but they start to see quality education, even in remote ways of educating children. And the connectivity gap that we know from before is actually now an opportunity to close, because the business around connectivity is doing great in this time. Everything has turned into digital. So UNICEF is also advocating for investing in remote learning, in connectivity, in closing the gap so that the 365 million children that are not connected to internet will be connected, because they have to be digitally skilled and have to be present in the digital world if they're going to thrive in the future. So schools open, yes, but also invest in new tools. On nutrition, UNICEF is also arguing that we need to continue to invest in routine in the health systems and not deprioritize what we already know we need to do. When it comes to malnutrition, we know that there are ready-to-use therapeutic food that can be delivered to the most in need. Hunger and famine is increasing. Together with World Food Programme and other colleagues, we are really there to help out to get it distributed, but we need money. Money is needed, and ODA is shrinking, remittances are shrinking. So there is a call to action to continue to invest and really in solidarity around this crisis that we see is increasing by the day. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I think, I just wanted to add a bit about, the kind of burden, for homeschooling, also the burden on parents and especially women.
Absolutely.
And so I think there need to be recommendations also to that effect and support, to that effect. So,
yes.
Yeah, we're all feeling it. Yeah. So next, so I would, so there's a question that Dr. Viroj has sent for Dr. Toda, and it's about, do you think global solidarity is too far away, as national governments have to account to their citizens, and particularly, in public health emergencies? And can you advise on how to strengthen global solidarity in the responses to COVID? And there is a similar question by Dr. Viroj to Fran on the issue of, again, I related to this kind of thing, the vaccine nationalism, and whether you think that high-income country governments are actually going to, get more than their share and then give it away to other countries as a sort of a policy and a political objective, of influencing other countries, using that as like a mechanism. So I would request Dr. Tora to please respond first, and then Fran.
Thank you.
Kindly make your responses slightly short, so that we can
Okay.
cover more questions.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Dr. Viroj, once again. It's all up to us whether or not global solidarity is far or real. It's all up to us. As Dr. Mitra mentioned rightly, COVID-19 has also provided us great opportunities. In fact, in the world of so-called international cooperation, I have been working to scale up the support to the developing countries in health sectors. But to be very frank, it was very tough. It was, yes, far from my dream. But last year, suddenly, the opportunity has come. And now, I'm very much delightful to declare to all of you that JICA will double our support to the developing world. So everybody has now been sensitized about the importance of global solidarity in the world of global health. Now we are on the very good opportunities. So it's all up to us whether or not we can make full use of this opportunity. And lastly, once again, very quickly, if we only stick to the important issues of financial resource allocations, vaccine and medicines, we always face the question of priorities, whether or not inside the nation or to the overseas, for the poor, for the elder, etc. So, in addition to make our best efforts to these difficult issues, we have to be very much enthusiastic about, as I said, wisdom sharing, hand washing, sanitation, and education. And we don't have to stick to IT. We can use conventional communication mechanism as well as an Afghanistan education minister said last year. So let us be really focused on the importance of these shareable resources. Thank you.
Thanks. Fran, would you want to respond to the question? And
I think I'm sure that if rich countries have excess vaccines, they probably will be used for foreign policy instrument. I mean, can actually see that happening in Australia, where a government that previously was not increasing foreign aid has done it very quietly because it had been part of its policy not to do that. And very clearly, part of that, I think, is a commitment to about 500 million for vaccines in the Pacific. And that's very much, I think, about supporting Pacific Islands, while China's also expanding its influence in that area. So it's very easy to see that as part of a foreign policy instrument, I think. But I think Ron Labonte's asked a question in the question and answer box, and I think he's saying rhetorically that if we can't even agree on a temporary TRIPS waiver to deal with the vaccine supply, then what's the likelihood of a much broader, whether it's a Marshall Plan for global health? But and the thing is, if we're not dealing with the global warming crisis at the same time as COVID, we might get through COVID and then find we've got another terrible, well, we know we will have another terrible global crisis if we don't do something about that. And of course, that in itself is coming from a country where we have a government that has been denying climate change for many, many years. And it's getting to the point when if we don't take action on both to recover from COVID and to stop further kind of global warming, then we're going to be in a really difficult position.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. I'll go now. I mean, there are a number of questions. I'll just now go first to Joss. And so there was, there was a question on, something that Dr. Mirza also spoke about of the non-COVID services. and with your experience in emergencies, and so the question is, whether any country was able to effectively manage COVID plus the other health concerns such as NCDs, malnutrition, mental health, and if yes, what factors have made them successful? Or if you want to even respond with respect to your previous experience, please go ahead. I think the question is more in terms of how can health systems be strengthened to respond to both crises at the all things at the same time. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you just gave the answer. We cannot really see routine services or its essential services as separate from in emergency response. What we've seen is that when COVID hit, and we see that also with other emergencies, the countries that are best able to respond are the ones with the strongest health system. And so what it takes is not an investment at the moment that an emergency hits, in this case COVID, but it's an investment that is needed all the way through, an investment in health systems that provides a good care, quality care, affordable care, access, that people have access to this care throughout the year. And when you have that, what you see is then the health system itself has built-in flexibility to actually deal with these emergencies that come on top of the regular work. And so, yes, of course, in any situation when an emergency hits, you will have an impact on the health system, and that you may face some disruption. But the question is how deep that disruption is, or how long it will last. And the stronger the health system is, the shorter that disruption will be, and the sooner the health system will be able to go back to its pre-emergency state. So the answer here is long-term investment in health systems is key if we want to avoid disruptions, but it's also key if we want to respond well to emergencies.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the point you said about investing in health systems, I think it's very critical. And in fact, a lot of our analysis says that it's not that they are not able to respond, but they've been weakened to such an extent, due to a lot of the factors that even Fran spoke about in the framework, due to privatization and, a lot of, reduction of health budgets. And so I think that's, very, very important and a takeaway from this pandemic, if there is one of the main takeaways. And I would go to Dr. Mirza on this, to just understand, when we're talking about the health system strengthening, to understand the role, a lot of evidence has been coming in globally that, the private sector or the for-profit sector has really sort of not been able to respond to the issues emerging out in the pandemic, and it's left to the public sector, which was already weakened and has very reducing investment in it historically, which has had to respond effectively to the pandemic. So I want to ask you with regards to both Pakistan and with regards to your work in the region of how did you see the private and the public health sector work, and then what are the lessons going forward on that?
Let me very quickly respond to the question. In line with what I earlier said, I think this is time to reimagine and rethink about the future of healthcare and healthcare systems, especially in low and low middle income countries, because most of our countries have already mixed health systems. There is a public sector and there is a private sector. I think what COVID-19 has also brought home is this realization that when an health emergency hits, then it does not just hit the public sector, it also hits the private sector. The private sector, healthcare, business and their system has also been very deeply affected with this. So I think that what it has opened up is space now in our countries is to rethink about different kinds of public-private partnerships to deliver the primary health care and the secondary and tertiary health care uh, on a same template of by developing national packages of essential health services and by expanding the national health insurance systems through full participation of the private sector. In most countries, the private sector is much larger actually than the public health sector. So I think that there is a need now for parties to come together and to rethink and reimagine the national healthcare systems with full participation of all stakeholders and with the new kind of public-private partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Direct question had come for her. And before that, I just wanted to also share that, India has a national health insurance scheme, quite a big one, but it completely fell flat on its face during the pandemic because neither were the private sector utilizing it. And, it just wasn't, able to respond to the crisis. And it was actually the public sector and the public hospitals that were, really taking care of people during, this period. Fran, there are two questions which I quickly just want to ask you, and they are sort of related. One is about, there's a question of on migrant workers and undocumented migrant workers. Sometimes they're not part of such insurance schemes and UHC coverages in countries. So how do you think more equitable access could be undertaken in the context of migrant undocumented workers and stronger social protection? The second question, I think, if you could also respond to, related to sort of this, was, how do voices of the more marginalized and vulnerable groups reach decision-making bodies? So if you can, please, we have just about 2 minutes remaining. So,
well, I mean, I think in terms of migrant workers, they should, if a scheme is universal, it should support everybody in a country. And in particular in a pandemic, it makes sense. I mean, it's a protection for everybody else to make sure everybody is protected. So we're sort of only, so that just goes without. And one of the big challenges we're facing in the world is so many displaced people, refugees, and I think we've already heard from Charlotte that those populations are suffering terribly from COVID. So there's no doubt they should be covered. Now the second question was, what was the second question? Sorry. So actually,
how do the voices of
about
marginalized and vulnerable groups be made?
Yeah, I mean, I think to generally democratize decision making, whether it's in health sectors where you ensure that people's voices are being heard, and one of the issues with privatization is that it's very rare that they're establishing participatory processes. And I think a way we can solve many of the problems is by having users of services, having people who are the recipients being involved and having a real voice, not a token voice, but an absolute real voice in that. So I think that's very important. I just made me think of Hassan Marla, and I always remember him when he was in Adelaide at the Healthy Public Policy Conference. He was telling a story about participation, about walking down a road, and there was a sign about an egg and bacon breakfast, and the pig said to the egg, "You see, for you it's just participation, for me it's total involvement." And he was making the point of the difference between participation and involvement. And I think we have to do that all the time, not have some token involvement, but really ensure, particularly in bodies like WHO, that the real voices having an impact are people's health voices. And of course, that's why the People's Health Movement was established, because we felt at the time in 2000 that WHO was hearing more from other voices and not from people's voices. And it's still just as relevant today, possibly more relevant today, I think.
Thank you very much, Fran. I would now call on Bridget. Bridget Lloyd is the ex-global coordinator of the People's Health Movement, and is from South Africa and has worked in non-governmental organizations and social movements for the last 30 years. And for over nearly a decade, she was the global coordinator of the People's Health Movement, and she remains actively involved in PHM both globally and in South Africa. I invite her to provide a summary of this rich discussion that we've had today. Bridget.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to go through a few points that most panelists raised first, and then I'm going to highlight a few points from each of the speakers, and then touch on a few points that have come up in terms of the way forward that have been echoed by a number of the speakers. I think it's been a very rich discussion that the speakers have basically comprehensively touched on most aspects of COVID. I think it's very difficult to cover everything because of the terrible impact and the strain on health systems as well as social systems. But we've touched on global, national, and regional impact of COVID, as well as how we've been coping with it. Nearly all of the panelists, if not all, highlighted the inequalities, the division between rich and poor, the impact of COVID on the most vulnerable of society, from migrants, women, children. Inequalities in health and health systems have come up by all speakers. And then the non-COVID related crisis, which is, I think just about everyone has spoken about some of the related crises that existed before COVID, but that some have worsened and some are just being neglected, or some are impacting further again on the most vulnerable. And these include the climate crisis, unemployment, which certainly in many countries has increased because of lockdown, and job insecurity developing. Mental health problems has been spoken about by a lot of people, and how we are actually not really aware fully yet of the impact of mental health that COVID has had. Children, which I'll touch a bit more on. Governance, the global governance for health as well as within countries, and political crises within countries. The parallel crisis that has taken place within the health systems, and the public health systems being under terrible strain, as well as the health worker crisis and collapse of some services within the health services, for example, maternal and child health, immunizations, etc. Charlotte spoke about the human rights crisis, but with a particular focus on the child rights crisis, and the impact of some of the COVID-related, for example, lockdowns and closing of education, and the impact that that's having on children, as well as the lack of child immunization and child services that have taken place, and the potential long-term impact of those. Quite a lot about the education and home education and the impact that is having, but as well as the lack of socialization or being in a classroom, and the digital divide, where those who have access to computers and internet are obviously in a better position to receive education than somebody in a rural area who has no technological support, or even possibly no phone lines. Also the increase, the need for an increase in access to certain services for children, which include education, health and immunization, access to water and sanitation, reversal of child poverty. Dr. Torda spoke about 3 pillars which have been successful in terms of how people have dealt. One is people's power and solidarity, using Taiwan as an example, and then the need for the shareable resources and a wisdom-based approach, as well as versatile solutions to COVID. Fran spoke about the multiple crises and put them down to an unfair global economic and political system based on extractive capitalism. She also spoke about the weakening of health systems and highlighted problems and what can be done, including the need for universal systems for health, education, employment, housing, energy, progressive taxation, equitable employment, education, and food opportunities, and just governance for health versus a profit-driven approach. Jos spoke about WHO, particularly globally, but particularly also in the Southeast Asia region, and some of the measures that have been undertaken which have worked, including regional networking and solidarity, sharing of resources. He spoke about how COVID has underscored the essential role of WHO at both the global and regional levels. And as many speakers did, spoke about the inequities, and that despite some trying to ensure equitable access to vaccine, there's also been a parallel process where some wealthy countries have been buying up vaccines, for example. Then Dr. Mirza spoke about, also spoke about the crisis beyond COVID, about the inequities and the impact on other health services, for example, non-communicable diseases, maternal and child health, mental health, and elaborated a bit further on the mental health crisis and how we are not really yet aware of how COVID has impacted on, on mental health. Also, for example, about some of the campaigns, for example, within Pakistan, where the polio campaign has resulted in an increase in polio, and this would be happening around the world. He also highlighted how health systems can no longer be thought of without social determinants of health being a core part of them, as well as intersectoral collaboration, and how COVID has actually provided the opportunity for other sectors to see the importance of health. He spoke about opportunities that COVID has presented, and that we need to use these opportunities to try and get more receptiveness across sectors for health and all policies. So some of the way forward that people highlighted, or what we really need, and these were echoed by a number of speakers. One is for solidarity, and that's global solidarity as well as within countries and within regions. People's power and action, sharing of resources and knowledge, equity and access to tests, treatment, and vaccine, and I think nearly everybody spoke about that. Strong public health systems and the need for more resourcing of the public health systems, as well as generally putting them higher on the political agenda. Education systems that can deal with such a crisis, and as well as to ensure that everybody has equal access to education. And then opportunities that COVID has presented are highlighting the social determinants of health and the impact of those on health, intersectoral collaboration, and the strong public health need for strong public health systems. I've asked Sulakshna to add if I've left any key things out. My internet cut a couple of times, so I apologize if I did leave out anything that was essential. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. I mean, I think that was very comprehensive. I don't think, you have, left out anything. So thank you again very much to Fran, Jos, Charlotte, Dr. Toda, Dr. Mirza, and Bridget. Thank you very much for joining us today. Good day and good evening.